Do you consider yourself a high achiever? Smart, driven, highly successful? I am so excited to have you. My name is Julia Arndt and I'm the host of the Stress Podcast. I will help you develop your stress resilience the same way you've developed your workplace superpowers. Learn peak performance tools to thrive at work and in your personal life. Let's get started. Hi, Andy, and welcome to the Stress Podcast. I'm really excited to have you today and really excited to talk with you about your two wonderful books that you wrote and hear about your life story.
Yes, well, I'm happy to be here.
Yes. Andy, I always start my podcasts with the question, what time is it? In which time zone are you? Where are you located? And what have you been up to today?
It is 9:06 in the evening in Amsterdam, Central European time. It is cold. It's probably it was 3 degrees today. So the temperature is going down. We had spring, and now I just finished my own podcast, ran downstairs. I made teriyaki dinner for my wife, and then I ran back upstairs to find you.
Nice. Okay, and you're sitting in a wonderfully green room.
Yes,
that
this
we
is
just
the green.
talked about.
This is the green screen. Every day, the podcast that I'm doing is on every single day, and I just wanted it to be different each day. So basically, we use a different screen each day, just from a picture, an object, something just to catch your eye.
Okay.
So that's the reason why we have green screen. I always think it's funny when there's nothing on it because it feels so naked.
Yeah, it looks very nice in the picture. So, Andy, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did your journey start, and how do you describe yourself today? How do you introduce yourself today?
Well, I mean, my journey started when I was young. My parents were at war with one another from the age of birth till 10. So dad, they shouldn't have married on one level because mom was Catholic and dad was Jewish, and they collided on values on a very, very deep level. And dad was also had a lot of like mental illness. He was just always very aggressive and angry and shouting and then loving. So he had the bipolar thing going, and he'd take drugs sometimes and other times he wouldn't. But for me, I was very sensitive as a kid. So I really had a hard time because I just couldn't shut down and I didn't know how to deal with it. So I really relied on my mom. And it was so that, when they got divorced when I was 10, I spent my life with her, and we were really very, very close. She was, not only was she my mom, she was really my best friend. And in a very interesting way, because I think sometimes, it takes you get into your you get older till you make friends with your parents. And with my mom, it was like the two rules were you wear a condom and you don't drink drive. And otherwise you live your life. I don't, two mistakes I can't take back. Right.
Yeah.
And she had an unplanned pregnancy, so that was for her really important. Okay. And then when I was my first year in college, she was hit and killed by a drunk driver, and that one incident that changed my life forever, because the one thing in my life that really gave it meaning was gone, and now I was forced to deal with like life without my steering. It was just I lost any sense of meaning. Like life had no meaning to me anymore at all. Like everything was like from one day to the next, you could say like everything I experienced was now black. Things that brought me great joy brought me nothing. It was just, it all came up to, for me, I ran track, and the biggest moment of my life was I was a walk-on athlete as a freshman, which was a big deal. To get on the team. And then the guy who was the best athlete, he got injured. So now I'm going to the conference finals. You get flown in an airplane. It was a really big deal. And in that track meet, I jumped my best ever. And I was one of I scored, I was the top 4 of the people competing, which is scores go back to my team. No one would have expected it. I should have been over the moon. And I remember feeling the emptiest feeling of my life. Like the one thing that a month ago, whatever, however long it would have been, I would have longed for was now achieved, and I didn't care.
Mhm.
And I think that was the last time I jumped, because in a way, whatever that was giving me wasn't serving me. So I'd say from that moment forward, just fell into depression, and I survived. Everyone could look and think I was functioning, but I just shut down. And I think from that moment forward, that was my life's journey, was how do I heal
Mhm.
from that loss, which was at such a critical moment in my own development. And then on the other side, I had this father who was the worst of the worst in terms of verbally abusive and screaming and yelling. And, I couldn't, so I didn't have any support system.
Mhm.
And that was my journey. I had to figure out, how do I reconcile these two big things in my life? No.
Wow. And how did you do that?
Well, the first thing I did was I escaped. So I said, I'm out of here, screw you, I'm gone. So I actually,
Mhm.
I left and I did exchange program. I studied for a year at Sydney, Australia. And
Mhm.
then in that year, I was like, wow, I'm feeling, I enjoy this traveling thing. So I spent another year, took a year off.
Mhm.
And I was like, I'm going to travel. I just got a backpack, traveled the world. And I think in a way I used that going away as a way to cope with the pain, and I just kept traveling and getting new experiences. But, I think like a drug addict, you're never going to replace the hole. So you
Mhm.
can keep taking more drugs, but it doesn't help at some point, because you're not going to get a big high. You've already had these really like cinematic experiences. And, if you force those into your life over and over again, it just isn't the same. So that wore thin after time.
Mhm.
And and then at the time after I did this trip, I went home and my dad disowned me. He basically said, "You've got 30 minutes. Take everything you own out of my house, and you're dead. You're dead. Never contact me again." It was very, very harsh breakup. But what happened was I got freedom in a way, because I'm like, hold on, like it's so funny. We don't realize how, even if we don't have contact with someone that has a big influence, they have a huge influence on us just through the mere fact we know what they're feeling or they're thinking. So when he said I was dead and kicked me out, it was almost like, wow, it was a weird mix of feeling sadness, but like, oh shit, I got my life back. Like, it's my life. I
Mhm.
decide what I do and how I live.
Mhm.
And then I just started traveling again. I went to Austria and lived in Austria for a few years, Switzerland. I did another year backpacking, lived in Japan. Like, I just went from country to country, and then spent the next years just really living and experiencing the world, and letting the world teach me the
Mhm.
lessons. And I finally ended up living in Austria for 10 years. And I got a good job, got in a role I never should have gotten into, but I made it in. And after 10 years, I was feeling the loneliness that I didn't deal with when my
Mhm.
mom died.
Mhm.
And it showed up in different ways. I would never be able to be like alone. I always needed
Mhm.
someone around, and I could never be quiet. Like, I needed to be on the phone incessantly, or
Mhm.
conversation, and every night of the week was booked with something just to occupy the quiet time.
Mhm.
And uh and I knew it on one level, but when you're coping, you just find ways to cope, and you don't think that there's something wrong here. And I think at some point I was unhappy with my job, and I complained for 2 or 3 years, and I got bored with myself. I'm like, oh my God, you're like that person who always complains and doesn't do anything. Like, I heard that in my head. And then
Mhm.
I met a man who was an incredibly wonderful teacher and a very intense individual. And I sold everything I owned, everything, just got rid of it all. And I lived in an attic space with no toilet, no heater, no running water, nothing. And it was just, I was like free. It was like I get a life do over.
Mhm.
And I spent 10 years living like a monk, just living, saying,
Oh.
I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to sacrifice. I'm not going to do anything for money the rest of my life. If it
Mhm.
doesn't suit how I want to live and what I want to do, I'm not in it. So I really lived like really like a monk. He was
Mhm.
very aggressive and strong. He didn't tolerate any level of I would say non-reflection. So you couldn't get by with you needed to take responsibility for everything you said, for every behavior, from every interaction with like you could never get away with anything. And I lived that way for 10 years. Very, very tense.
Okay. Where was that?
That was in Amsterdam.
That's in Amsterdam. And
Yeah,
okay, just like picking up from age perspective, how old were you when your mom died?
Oh, we're talking when my mom died, I was 18.
Okay.
And then when I got, I traveled for several years, like I mentioned, living in Japan and working there for a few years. But I got my first real job, let's say at about 24 at this Austrian company.
Okay.
And then I worked there for about 10 years. So I'm now about 34. And
Okay.
that's when the kind of midlife crisis breakdown happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I said, I'm starting life over again. And that's when I moved to Amsterdam, where I worked with my mentor at that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you did that for 10 years as well?
I did that for 10 years. Yeah. Just 10 years of really, and it was really beautiful because I was the director of a company in Austria. So big ego, big, and then I was I would even call it a servant. I was a servant to another person's dream that was very big. And I was ready to take that role of not being the leader. So letting somebody else fill those shoes and supporting them lovingly and everything they needed to flourish.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for all those years. It was really, really beautiful, beautiful experience.
Wow. And what happened after that?
Well, what happened was he had cancer once before. It came back, and then it got progressively worse, and then he eventually had a heart attack and died. So in a way, it was a strange mix of feelings because he died, and it was really sad to lose him, and yet it was like, now I'm starting over again, just like I started over again from the attic space when I left Austria. It felt like every 10 years feels like there's sort of like a life do-over a bit. Like, who are you now and what are you being called to be? And it's, of course, there's fear because you don't know what it's going to be. You just know it's going to be different. And then I guess I didn't know then, but I thought, like, I want to do something that I'd never done before. And then I wrote a book, and I didn't have a title. I didn't have a concept. I just started writing and writing and writing and writing. And then the book created itself in some ways. I wrote it on my honeymoon under the covers. My wife was sleeping. Every morning I'd wake up at 5 and I'd write for 2 hours. And then I'd read her what I wrote. And then if she kind of cried, I'm like, oh, wow, there's something here. And if she was, detached, I could tell from how she reacted to the writing, if it was striking a chord or not. Yeah.
And that's the last letter. Yeah,
that was the last letter. And that went so well, it kind of scared me because in one way I didn't want it to go. I mean, I didn't want it to go bad, but I just wanted to do the book, have said I did it. And then it got a lot of traction. There were people buying it for other people. So it did better. And it was scary for me because I was like, wow, like now I feel like there's something built and I don't have any idea what I intended to do from it. I just, what I did take away though, was that I mentioned my mom died, and I guess it would have been 2 or 3 days before she died, I had a premonition that she may not be there the rest of my life. And I was taking a sociology of death class. So it wasn't just a premonition. It was in front of me every day. And so I wrote her a letter to say everything I wanted her to know, as if she might not be there. And she got that letter a few hours before she was killed by this drunk driver. So that stayed with me, of course, all those years. And the book is called The Last Letter because I wanted to give other people the opportunity to write to someone that they might take for granted that they'd always be there, and write something beautiful as if they might not be there. Take the same energy I had and write it for themselves. And that's what happened. So I drove for 3 months through America. I stopped at 60 locations. I jumped on some big morning shows in some of the states and just shared, hey, I'm here. If you want to, you can sit down. I'll create some space for you to feel comfortable. And then you'll write a letter to somebody as if it's the last one you'll ever send them. And you can imagine how deeply emotional those sessions were. They were really, really intense. Yeah.
What is the last letter about?
The last letter was basically my life. It was from the point
Okay.
where mom was killed,
Mhm.
which was for me, life before that was uninteresting. It was just basically going through the ropes. So it was taking if you're going to look at it like a hero's journey, that was the moment that I needed to make peace with in my life if I was gonna be happy.
Mhm.
Because what I was doing before that, I was trying to find happiness, as we all do, by going and doing things,
Mhm.
distracting yourself by doing things that give you, set moments of happiness, right? But that underlying joy, that kind of happiness of just being alive, happiness. I mean, that I had no concept for because it was so far away from me.
Mhm.
So yeah, that was the journey to how did I move from that experience, and then I shared how each country I lived in, because there would be 7 countries in that time frame, like how each one informed how I look at the world and how I experience it, and how that helped me overcome or make peace with the loss of my mom, and not only make peace with it, but almost find another level of joy in that every tear is bringing me closer to the thing that I was so afraid of feeling, which is just alive in the end.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because we always want to avoid, especially in Western culture, avoid pain because, God, that can't be good. And for some, it can't be because you can fall into depression. But there's another level of like where the pain is really like a pointer to how much I love my mom and
Mhm.
how much I miss her. And I believe in time, you kind of can feel into this other level of where the pain actually, you don't really live until you allow yourself to feel the pain, because if you push down pain, you push down joy in equal measure. You don't get to say, I'm going to have a lot of joy, but I'm going to avoid pain. It doesn't work that way. You embrace all the emotions or none, right? That's how it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why do you think you were so sad and so troubled after your mom died? Was it because you didn't have really time to say goodbye, or like what
No.
kind of thoughts
Well,
did go on in your head at that
I
time?
think at 18, I was really reliant on her. Like, mom
Mhm.
was the person in my life who, if I looked at anyone, she was the only one I could rely on.
Mhm.
That everyone's has that unconditional love, or they don't all have it, but let's say if you have had that unconditional love, like that gives you so much power. Like, you can go out in the world and fail, and you feel like I can always come back to my safe harbor of that unconditional love.
Mhm.
And she was the only one that gave me that.
Mhm.
So when that was gone, I lost any semblance of feeling, wow, I feel safe.
Mhm.
The world just felt unsafe. Everything felt scary.
Mhm.
Everything was a risk because at that point, imagine I don't have any contact with my dad. I'm 18 years old. I don't know how am I going to get the money to go to school, and what am I going to do? It was just all in chaos at that moment in my head.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
And so from 18 to 34, or like at what point did you feel safe again?
I'd
Because you
say,
said, right, because it's like that unconditional love. And usually people say, oh, you should
uh,
have unconditional love for yourself. You shouldn't look for it in anyone else, right? Do you
sure.
believe that too? Or what's your take on
I mean, first of all, it's always funny. I always say, if you start a sentence with "Do you believe?" then I'll always answer no. Before you finish the sentence, it's kind of. I would say that at any given moment, anyone's experience is whatever they need to serve them with the challenge they're facing. So for me, for those earlier years, the challenge I was facing was just survival.
Mhm.
So finding joy and going traveling, that was what I needed. I don't judge it. I don't think it was negative in any way. And
Mhm.
at some point I saw, wow, this only will take me so far. And then life gives you hints, right? If you're lucky, it doesn't give you a heart attack, or
Mhm.
it doesn't give you obesity. Like, those are the things where your body is telling you there's something wrong here and you're not listening.
Mhm.
But so I would say that on one level, I've seen, I at this moment, I do very much see in myself that peace is an inward journey. I'm responsible for my own peace, not you. My
Mhm.
wife isn't responsible for my happiness. If she's unhappy, she gets to be unhappy. It doesn't make me unhappy. If it's not like that codependency left my life through the journey that I took with my mentor case. Not
Mhm.
at the beginning. At 35, it was a 10-year journey to start to let go of so much. I mean, every single thing I was attached to, I just had to let it go, which feels like a death. Everything you attach to that you let go of, it's really a death experience because it's part of what made you who you are. And now you're saying goodbye to it.
Mm-hmm.
So in a weird way, and it's very Buddhist in that way, is like making peace with letting go of all that attachment brings you just to a state of peace because everything is just perfect. And if you start saying, no, it's not, then you say, oh, because I had an outcome or an expectation that's not fulfilled. And then you get to learn another thing about yourself that you hadn't yet seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And during what time did you meet your wife then?
I met her, I guess I would have been in the Netherlands for 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
And it was quite a different, I would always, when I met a woman, like I always found like weak, effeminate females that I felt like I could heal and take care of.
Mm-hmm.
And it would always be like a weird thing. Like I would be attracted to them because I felt like I could fix them. But then in time, I'd be resentful because they didn't change.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be like a very typical, and I see it of a lot of males, is that you get caught in this idea like I'll heal you, I'll be the one, and I think that in that time or the shift for me was like, oh, I'm not responsible for anyone else but myself,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a big shift for me when in terms of a romantic relationship because I hadn't experienced a romantic what I would call a healthier romantic relationship because I was always I got my identity by fixing the other person, and you could imagine where that goes, right? It's just, yeah, not well. So yeah, I met her 2 years after, and we spent, years being what I would say incredibly good friends and partners, and that was such a different experience than anything else I had experienced before then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And so you wrote the last letter, and then you went on your 3 months cross-country trip from East Coast to West Coast.
Yeah, the opposite, West Coast to East
West
Coast.
Coast to East Coast. Okay. And you wrote, because of that, The Wounded Healer.
Yeah, because I didn't even have the intention to write another book, but I'm in the car driving alone for 3 months, having these incredible experiences. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? So along with the directions, getting to the next city, I played my voice recorder and I would speak out all these experiences, like what happened, who said what. I learned a little bit how to write the book in my words because there is, of course, a little bit different way. So I would speak more in light of how it would be read.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that more thoughtfully, I guess. And then I didn't even know what I would do with those files. There were over 100 of them at the end. And I uploaded them to some web page, not knowing if they'd even come back in any order. And then they came back and I read them and I'm like, yeah, this could be something. It actually was interesting. And then what I saw was that there was a major theme coming out of the interactions I was having, and that was the whole self-love as a driving force. And I see, even for me, not only the people I was working with, but self-love has been a really hard, it still is, one, like to fully love myself and to fully embrace it myself, and to celebrate, right? The book did well. And I tell you 20 reasons why it wasn't a big deal that the book did well. Like I would say, oh yeah, it did really well, but there's so many other books and it didn't sell, and it could have done this, didn't get on this, didn't win an award. Who knows? I would have told you every reason why it wasn't good, just because I would feel so self-conscious that I'm not going to celebrate myself as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the second book, in The Wounded Healer, I mean, even there's a beautiful story of sort of when I went to the Jefferson House. Thomas Jefferson has a house in somewhere along the East Coast, and I got caught in like the only ice storm that they've had there in some God knows decade, and I couldn't get off the mountain, and we're all stuck for hours waiting there, and I'm like, I'm going to be late for my book because I'm doing my session and the book signing or whatever. And if I don't leave now, it's a 3-hour drive to get to Virginia Beach. I'm going to miss it. So I said to this woman who was running the group, I said, hey, I know this sounds a bit weird, but I kind of got to get off the mountain if I can, because I need to do this book thing. And she's like, are you an author? And I'm like, yeah, I'm an author. And then she gets on the microphone and says, we have an author that needs to get to a book signing. And then basically, so this whole, like, I've got like a unit of 4 people getting, and everyone that met me said, are you an author? Are you an author? And it was like the hardest thing for me to say I'm an author. It was
Mm,
like, no, I've written this book, right? But I mean,
mm,
it doesn't make me an author. But so now I'm like laughingly being forced by the universe to say over and over, to the point where I just start to laugh at the absurdity that the only way I'm going to get off this mountain is if I embrace that I'm an author and don't,
yeah,
hedge. Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah. That's really
yeah, that was
wonderful.
really a beautiful experience. So
Yeah.
that self-love practice turned into the thing that is now quite well established on the internet, is say the thing that you resist most in you at this moment, and follow it with, and it's fucking great.
Hmm.
So I have a hard time admitting that I'm an author, and it's fucking great. And now as a group on Facebook, there's a few hundred people, and on a daily basis, someone will just say, I haven't had sex in 5 years, and it's fucking great. And the whole premise is celebrate the thing that you can't make peace with,
Hmm.
and no one is there to heal you. No one's there to say, hey, I have that. Everyone gets to feel their own discomfort in listening to you share. So it's really a place where people get to share without needing to feel like they have to take any responsibility for the emotions it causes in others.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's been a really beautiful byproduct of the book and the people who have gravitated towards it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So the Wounded Healer is about self-love.
it's totally self-love. Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Well, as I mentioned, I think as one does their work, right? As they start working and dealing with their own emotional blocks. I think one of those like hidden blocks that feels counterintuitive, you don't think about all that much, is, do I really love myself?
Hmm.
You don't think about it all that much. I just am. I don't think I do or don't like. But then you start realizing that you judge yourself for so many things, like subtle or otherwise. You judge yourself for how you deal with money. You judge yourself because of your interest in your sexual, whatever your sexual preferences are.
Yeah.
There's just this constant judging machine going on in the background, and in some weird way, it's so quiet and deadly that we don't even really even want to acknowledge that voice is always whispering shit in our ears, and we take it seriously without even knowing it. So in some weird way, I think for me, the holy grail of sort of like just really celebrating everything that was going on up here was just saying, hey, I don't need to be a slave to trying to negatively push that away. I can celebrate the hell out of it, you
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
and just say things that one might not be another person might not be comfortable with, but that's not my issue. That
Hmm.
I'm not going to edit myself because the world can't deal with all the things in my head. I can't make peace with it, because that's why I was stuck to begin with. I was editing because I didn't want to make others uncomfortable. So now I get to say, you know what? I'm tired. I'm exhausted, and it's fucking great. I
Hmm.
don't know what's going to happen, or I lost a big client, and it's fucking great.
Hmm.
And really feel, maybe repeat it 3 or 4 times until it's like, oh, I let go of that.
Hmm.
That I don't have to hold on to that anymore.
Yeah.
There's a
Because you
real
feel
release in
accepted.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a really great maybe connection to the next question I have for you, which is, how do you deal now with negative thoughts? Is that your coping mechanism, or are there any other strategies when it comes to just all that chatter in our heads, and what you mentioned, the self-love and the
Mm,
critical piece of always, of us always criticizing ourselves,
mm.
and because of that of others too, right?
Sure, of course. I mean, once we judge ourselves, we obviously judge whatever that is in the other. Um, I think so. I told you I lived like a monk for those 10 years, and that really had a deep impact on how I experience my brain.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think my brain is really stupid. Like it just it gets distracted quickly. It pulls this way. It sees boobs and it says boobs, boobs, boobs. Whatever it does, it does. Like I don't control it. It's fine. And I think the the beauty of kind of allowing my brain to be and not attaching to what it's thinking is not to get stuck.
Mhm.
Because in some ways, the thoughts are the thoughts. They're going to come. Where the thoughts get burdensome is when you attach to the thought and say, oh my God, why am I thinking this? And how do I fix it? So in some ways, I would say, we don't choose what we think, but we do choose what we deal with once the thought comes.
Mhm.
Because once the thought's in our head, then we can decide, do we attach to that thought? And then we do, and I really see my brain as a dumb creator of thoughts that are actually of no use or value. I really do. I mean, I don't
Mhm.
exaggerate. I really do see that. So I spend a lot of time just looking at stuff. Like I spend the day walking really aimlessly, and I'm just looking at the beauty in everything I'm seeing. And I'll shoot my pictures. I post 5 or 6 pictures a day of just the beauty of the things that are less obvious, just the beauty of just being. And I find that imaginative space that it's not avoiding negativity, it's just being present with what is.
Mhm.
And then there's the time, right? And it happens, so that's not only that, but there's the time when you have the person who comes into your life that adds a friction. You're like, oh shit. And I think in that way, I would say the tool that I've told you, the self-help, that's been one of those tools I've used for
Okay.
sure.
Okay.
I guess the tool I use more is dialogue.
Mhm.
I really, there's only one individual in my life, which I see I actually don't have the talk because there's bigger reasons not to have the talk. But other than that, I'll go to everyone and say, hey, listen, this is what's going on for me.
Mhm.
And I'm not even like, forget about this, my truth stuff. I'm not trying to, I'm saying, and I'm not sure how to support or what to say. And so I'm very comfortable with a vulnerability, which
Mhm.
I feel creates a lot of space for dialogue.
Mhm.
So I don't run into that many troubles in my life.
Mhm. Mhm.
Even when people project onto me. If you project onto me with really negative stuff, I'm like, yeah, there's probably some truth to it. So what do you see? And so I'm really creating a lot of space, even for the people who you might think, why would you create that space? Because if I don't attach to whatever I should be, then there's a lot of space you can create in the world.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really beautiful. I love that you say that. And um I just had another question. Let me think if I
Mm,
remember what I wanted to ask you. Yeah, I connect with that message on a really deep level. I'm really glad that you're mentioning vulnerability and how much dialogue it actually opens when you are honest, and how many things get assumed and get lost from miscommunicating or not communicating. So I
yeah.
think I really believe in that. And, I work a lot with corporations as well. And I try to teach employees on how to be more vulnerable in the workplace,
Yeah.
because I think because again, we all think that we are perfect human beings, especially in the workplace. We all like to portray ourselves that way. But when we actually start to be vulnerable and say why we can't do certain things, people are like, oh yeah, they
Yeah.
also actually are a human being and they also have a life, and I can actually connect to that, and that connection creates so much more space and so much more understanding for each other.
Yeah.
So that's really beautiful that you.
Yeah. Yeah, we had my show today, actually, right half an hour before we got on, was the trap of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I saw was that, or a trap of authenticity, actually, because at least two go hand in hand. But what I noticed is that in society, it's also been elevated as one should be authentic, or you need to be authentic, or
Mm-hmm.
you're not being. It's used even as a tool sometimes to manipulate another person, like you're not being authentic, right? So the whole show today was quite interesting, was taking that look at what is really authenticity when we break it down as not, when it becomes a belief, then it kind of becomes weaponized. That's what what I've often also seen. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you feel like you've made peace now with your mom's death?
You know, interesting question. I I, I wouldn't ever. I would almost say I don't want to make peace with my mom's death.
Mm-hmm.
Almost the beauty of knowing that there's a love there that hurts that it's not there is what keeps her close.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a self-torture or a self-pity. It's just, it feels great to know how much I miss her.
Mm-hmm.
Even as I speak now, I can feel the tears come up. And that's when I'm like, yeah, I really loved and love her,
Mm-hmm.
and just grateful. And I think when we say make peace, a lot of times it's like it's not what you intended, of course not. But it's like, have you separated enough from your emotions that it's not a problem anymore? It's not, but that's often the way people go through life, is that way. And I'd say no. I feel like it took me 30 years to cry at how much it hurt to lose her, and I don't want to lose those 30 years again.
Mm-hmm.
That's the feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. I remember the question that I wanted to ask you. So,
Yeah.
because of all these thoughts that you have in our heads on a daily basis,
Yeah.
how do you make decisions? Because how do you differentiate between, what is real and
Yeah.
what is
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
better, right?
It's a really good question. I so in the 10 years that I spent sort of redefining myself, I started to learn that one can make a decision, or you can live by certain principles that guide you. And in some degrees, decisions are made for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so my mentor told me freedom is absence of choice.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm living a principled life, then basically everything that occurs, I'll be guided by a principle that I've aligned myself with, and then it'll just define for me what makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not make sense to the outside world or the people around me, because they might be using a different measuring stick for why one thing or the other. But if the measuring stick is, am I connected? Am I feeling full? Is this decision bringing me closer to myself or further away from myself? And a lot of times the outside world would look at decisions I make and think I'm an idiot. Like, what are you doing? And I'm thinking to myself, God, I've had the best year of my life. Like, I'm getting, COVID year was the best year for me. I was having the best time. And I had people, judging how I was living, and thinking to myself, interesting. So if the if the benchmark is, hey, are you enjoying and having a great life? If that's the benchmark, then we'd say, hey, isn't that a nice way to live? But a lot of people think, hey, if you could be making more money by monetizing something that you haven't monetized yet and focusing on that, you think to yourself, oh my God, like, what's the criteria you're using to decide what you're going to do, or where you're going to put your focus?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the principles. So,
Mm-hmm.
and those principles are things that they come up daily. They're embedded on some level. I don't need to think about them, but sometimes someone asks me, why did you do it? And I say, oh, I followed this principle. And then I'd say what the principle is, and make it more explicit if it might help them in figuring that out for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Is for
Yeah.
you a principle like a value? Would you say?
No.
No?
Principle is kind of like, it's like a kind of a tenet, like the word, like I wouldn't even call it a belief. It would be or maybe I've never used it like this, a functioning belief. I
Mhm.
say, like, I mean, a few things. Like if I go into a group, I never prepare when I coach or mentor, or even go in front of a group for a 2-day training. I'll just go in front and just be there for 2 days.
Mhm.
And so the only thing I can do for those 2 days is say, I'm going to follow certain principles. Like, first principle is, if you don't have any intention to be here, then it's probably not going to work. Because if you don't have a reason to be here, then you don't know why you're here, and I don't know why you're here. So let's solve that one first. So why do you want to spend 2 days with me? Let's start there. And
Mhm.
you could design a course, but you could say principally it's just basic math. Like, if you don't know why you're there, then why are you here? Like, I tell people in my training, better if you don't want to be here, like, leave. I'm not going to hold you here. Like, I don't want you to be here if you're not really enjoying. And the only way I know you're really present is if you set an intention. What might not use the word intention. It might be, what do you want to get out of this time? Intention can be loaded in a corporate environment.
Mhm.
So that's a basic principle. It's just an obvious basic principle. And then
Okay.
another principle would be like, if we are not going to avoid a problem, because in avoiding it, it's just going to linger and it's going to stink the room. So we can park a thing. Maybe we can't talk about it in public, but what we're not going to do is we're not going to pretend that it doesn't exist. So
Mhm.
that'll just be a principle.
Mhm.
With my wife, we don't have anything there's nothing that we are not going to discuss. Period. Nothing. We
Mhm.
can say not now because we're not comfortable at that moment, but we can't say not discuss. That's never happened. Never has, never would. So those are just simple principles. And if you live by those principles, then sort of what I've found is the world shapes itself around you. Like, you
Mhm.
don't, like, you just get the world you want, and you don't know how because you're not trying. You're more like a divining rod. You decide how you live, and the world kind of fills in the gap of molding itself around you. And you don't blame anybody. You don't tell them how they have to live, but you just decide how you live, and people find you that resonate with that way of being, and then you sort of evolve a life. And it takes some time, of course, because you could imagine you need to be consistent, because if you're inconsistent, you behave one way one time, and another way, then all of a sudden people don't know they don't understand you anymore. So you live a life which is like you'd say kind of like Gandhi, like be the thing you want to see in the world. And the more you are that thing, the more you'll attract people that also want to be more like you. And then they'll inspire you and you inspire them. And there's sort of a reciprocation of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very beautiful, actually. And so
Yeah.
what do you do now? So you wrote the second book. You have your podcast every night.
Yeah, and those have nothing to do with my work. Those are just things I do to sort of give to the world, just to the people that. What I actually do is, my wife she always gets frustrated when I answer. She says, "Just say this." So I am what you would call an advisor to family offices, families that have wealth, and they put the wealth and they want to deploy it into nonprofits or into profitable businesses, and they want to use what I would again say good principles of understanding, and then they want to hire good people that are aligned to their values. They say, "Hey, will you do us a favor? Come in, support us as we spend this money," because you can imagine how much wasted it is if you don't use good decision making. So there's a lot of support, but it's not the balance sheet support. It's the let me talk to the CEO who's not performing and make sure that he's dealing with his own issues, usually emotional, home, things in the family. Like I'll get to that level of intimacy, not like you're not performing. It's like, hey, I'll live with his family for a week, sit at the dynamic in the family and say, okay, now we know what the problem is in the office. So how are you feeling? And there's a lot of trust in that kind of way of working and living. But you can imagine, like, I only work with people I love, people that are friends, and there's basically no one, that I wouldn't have contact with well after we're working together, because there's a bit like being with family. Yeah.
That's such
It
an
really feels that way.
interesting direction for you as well, how your life took course, I assume, right?
Yeah. That all changed after my mentor died. Because when he died, I wrote the book, and then I said, I did business well. Like I became the director of this company and I did well, and then I dropped out completely. And I'm like, you know what? I can go back in, but go back in being who I want to be, and then see who meets me here. Because I didn't know who was going to find me. It took me years to I was alone, making no money at all, doing what I did, highly effective. Because funny thing is, if you're really well connected and you're dealing with really serious issues, you can resolve a lot of things no one else can resolve. If two people are screaming at one another, I love being in the middle of it. Like that's where I love being, because I have compassion for both. I can let them go. I can create space. I can laugh and say, okay, let me share what's going on in his head. Let me share what's going on. So I can live each party's head. And then, so everyone feels seen and understood. And then I can hit the button to say, okay, so now where are we going to go? And then kind of, alleviate the tension. And that gift, I just lived it. And then at some point I just got contact with people who said, wow, I want that gift in all of the businesses I'm going to be doing. And then that just became a life. So it wasn't even planned. It just emerged. And I thought, wow, this is really beautiful. And so I get to work in a lot of these incredible nonprofits that are helping kids, parents, education, just everything that sort of has a kind of a beautiful impact in the world. And that's just brought me great joy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my last question for you is, how did you decide on the book title, The Wounded Healer? What does it mean for you, The
Oh,
Wounded Healer?
when I was driving on this trip, I first of all, I did these sessions I just mentioned. I'd never done one of those sessions before I got on the trip. Like the first session I did was the first of the 60. Can you imagine? I mean, like on one level, I just had to take a deep breath and just say surrender to whatever's going to happen. And the first one was a mess. It was like so bad that it was like, oh, in a way it was kind of good, because I thought I can't get any worse than this. But the whole was that as I went through the process, I started to discover something that I'd never seen before, was that in a way, men in general, they have this knack and desire and need to solve things, to fix things, to try to explain how to do it right. And I think what I quickly began to see was that actually in these 60 sessions, I cried every single time. Every time I told the story, I said, I'm not going to step over my emotions again. I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt. I'm just not going to do it. And I did it. And what I was seeing and discovering was that in allowing myself to be so vulnerable in all of these different contexts, that immediately everyone in those sessions was dropping into another level of vulnerability that they otherwise wouldn't have touched. Because if I came in as a trainer or someone that was thought they knew, like, hey, I've got this tool and I'm going to make your life better. Like, oh my God, they would have shut down and they would have felt like, but they see me in front of a group of 40 people crying and saying, and this is not easy for me. And I know what I'm asking of you. I'm not asking and saying that you have to do it, but I'm saying this is an invitation. And I just saw that immediately gave these people access to emotions that they did not expect. And what started to emerge for me from that was like, wow, actually, once you've made peace with your own wounds, you are really a healer for everyone else. And that was where, and this concept was not new. I did not invent any of this. There's been beautiful books written, but it encapsulated what that experience was for me. And I said, the book is The Wounded Healer. I just knew it in the middle of the trip. Yeah. And then the self-love practice emerged because I had some contact with a beautiful man named Peter Koenig from Switzerland. And he's British, but he lives in Switzerland. And he did this practice, and I just used that practice and just put it on steroids just to experience what it would feel like. And then that self-love emerged as a natural consequence. So in some weird way, again, very unplanned, because I didn't know anything. I didn't even know, like I mentioned, that there would be a book. I just wrote the experiences. So that's kind of how it emerged. That's just been the pattern, is just let yourself be fully vulnerable in the writing and let the writing tell you where it belongs. Don't force it in any direction. And that's how the books got written. Yeah.
Do you have any favorite books that really influenced your life?
You're going to laugh. I don't read much.
Okay. I don't laugh about that. I think.
Yeah, it's almost going back to the thoughts. It's almost like I have enough random thoughts in my head. Another person's random thoughts in my head. It's like I'm already kind of overthought. But I'm trying to think what book. I mean, you kind of laugh. Like a book that I really enjoyed was by Russell Shorto, and he was actually on my podcast some years ago, some months ago. But it was Amsterdam, the world's most liberal city. And what I loved about that book, was that everything that I was seeing while I was living here, I couldn't make sense of. So I looked at behavior, but I never traced it back to its source. Like, why are Dutch so finicky about money, right? Or why are they so direct when they talk to you? Like all of these kind of things that I saw, but I didn't know where they really stemming from. And in his book, it was almost like unfolding and saying, "Oh my God, like wow, now I get it." So that was why I really loved it. I think I like watching movies, so we reviewed on my own podcast a few weeks ago the movie Being There with Peter Sellers, and I think in some ways that medium with really beautiful content really draws me in. So yeah, that was like an example of a film which at a very young age, it was 1979 they made that had such an impact on me that I actually used it on our show for an hour, talking only about how the scenes were very much aligned to things of projection work, like when people project onto one another, like how everything in that movie is actually everything I'm doing today. So that was just that I like making those connections, and that was so yeah, that would at least be I can give you that film because
Nice.
that was
No, I love that. That's actually wonderful. I think you just choose where you get your thoughts from. I think
yeah,
it doesn't matter if it's a movie or if it's a book or a
yeah.
podcast or you talking with people.
You know who I get most of my information from is, funnily enough, my wife,
Mm,
because my wife loves watching TED Talks. She loves listening to the Economist podcast. So she listens to all these podcasts, and of course, I'll be in the room at times. So I passively listen to what's going on. Then we'll have a dialogue around that as well. So yeah, that's also one of the sources.
wonderful. Well, Andy, it was a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. I think you shared some really wonderful things, and I hope that people will be able to connect and maybe feel a little bit easier in their pain and maybe all of the thoughts that they have sometimes, and just be okay with them. So thank you so much for your time today, and I wish you all the best for the next 10 years of your life.
Thank you. You as well.